Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. What the overall podcast is going to be about today is social media, and particularly social media and crime. But the Crime Tapes podcast is created in association with Staffordshire University and hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Each week it revolves around themes of crime with an expert from the university in to discuss their subject area. This week we're joined by Laura Allen, who's the Digital Communication Manager at Staffordshire University, and myself, Professor James Treadwell, and Kyla Lawton.
Hello.
Are going to be talking to Laura about some cases where crime has become associated with social media, and particularly whether social media is increasing cases around particularly problematic behaviour such as controlling and coercive behaviour and stalking. Laura, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problems at all. So crime and social media, it's a sort of interesting, it's an interesting world to enter into. As someone who's a little bit older, I tend to not know an awful lot about social media. I tweet prolifically and get called the middle class twonk. I occasionally, and it is very, very sort of occasionally, visit Facebook. But social media and a number of sites seem to be having quite an impact on crime generally. We've talked previously about things like memes and the use of memes and how imagery is shared and how that can be used to sort of create quite conflicting relationships at times. But the other side of social media that we think we perhaps don't think of so much is how social media is generally quite a good way of communicating with people. And I guess as a digital communication manager, you must know quite a lot about social media. So for someone uneducated and not very familiar like me, what are we talking about when we talk social media?
So social media, I guess, is any development in communication. So it's a new form of conversation. So we're moving away from traditional methods where we might take a phone call with somebody or meet somebody for coffee, and we're moving more towards digital methods, which is online on apps mainly. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the more informal places like Tinder and dating apps and that kind of thing today as well. So so it's basically having conversations but on a digital platform, and I suppose that changes the way that we're talking as well, and the way that we're having those conversations. So moving more towards like text messaging format and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, something which I've never really mastered at all. I mean, I still can't use an emoji, and when we get into the realm of what is a GIF or a meme, Kyla's had to educate me. I'm completely lost. But working in a university, you tend to be at the forefront, I guess, very often of sort of engagement, because it is quite often a younger audience that we think of, or at least associate with, engaging with new forms of social media that tend to be at the forefront of sort of social changes and picking up on technologies and adopting them and incorporating them into their lives. So particularly students were the first group that I came across that sort of very much used Facebook. But even platforms like Facebook have given way towards things like a little bit towards things like Instagram, haven't they? And Instagram and lifestyle sort of
my
influences.
dog has an Instagram page.
Yeah.
Kyla's dog has an Instagram page.
I don't, but my dog does.
Do you manage the dog's Instagram, or does he manage it?
She does it herself.
Oh, she does that herself.
She's really quite good like that. Yeah,
brilliant. So I guess you're right in some aspects that the newer forms of social media like Instagram, Snapchat, that kind of thing, are being led by the younger generation. And I mean, when I was at college, when I first sort of started using social media, I suppose it was things like MySpace and that sort of stuff, and that's how it began, and it was very much the younger population. But then as we moved to Facebook and they start developing and more younger people go on there, and then obviously parents and that sort of stuff want to be on there.
There's a special thing that certain people of a certain age that use Facebook do, that they'll share sort of like, have you seen this dog? And it's in Toronto. And it's like, Mom, you live in Crewe. Nobody's going to see this dog from Toronto. Or someone's nicked a bike and it's from like London and it might be seen in like the Outer Hebrides. It's like, stop.
I think that's the difference, isn't it? Because the older generation haven't been brought up
No.
With social media, like we have especially Gen Z, they've never known a life without social media. So the older generation, like my mum, she doesn't have social media, but I imagine if she did, she would very much be very gullible about everything that's on there and be consuming it and as fact, in the same way, I suppose, like the Daily Mail headlines and that kind of thing become fact to an older generation, a certain demographic. It's that kind of thing. So yes, it is very much the younger generation leading the newer platforms, but I think in a way they're also trying to escape the older generation, which are joining certain platforms as well.
I can't like anything by that old person because it wouldn't necessarily be cool enough. Now, and I've certainly encountered some of that in academia because, for example, when it first sort of emerged, Twitter was regarded as quite a useful vehicle for academics. I think anything that could condense them down to 150 characters is probably quite a useful thing for academics. But Twitter was sort of well used. But even now, I've seen some academics move towards forums like Instagram because they're more associated with a sort of younger, cooler crowd. So if you're trying to get your message out, for example, on drug research to young people, Instagram seems to be. And there's a sort of, it's more, as I understand it, Instagram is more sort of image based, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I agree with that. That especially in academia, that they are almost following the younger audience and trying to find them, but we have to understand why that younger audience is using that platform. Are they using it to interact with academics, or are they using it to socialise with their peers? And are we then invasive of their space?
Yes.
And because it is almost like a personal space for them, and they only want to be exposed to what they want to be exposed to. So if they are seeking certain information, then they probably would use still the more formal Twitter and LinkedIn as those information sources rather than the more personal spaces where they're socialising.
But I think you make a really interesting point, though, when you were saying about the way that we think of these spaces as personal, because that's where, if as we move into the arena of crime, I think that's perhaps where there can be a kind of invasive element as well. And this is where the dark side of social media sort of comes in. And this morning I was reading through my Twitter feed where I came across a story of Instagram struggling to remove images of that had been posted in the United States of a woman called Bianca Devins, who was murdered. She was murdered, it sounds, by someone known to her, where people were following both on Instagram, and photographs of her murdered body or her body after the murder were posted up on Instagram, and the platform is now trying to sort of remove them. It's alleged the person who killed her posted them up, and then you also get the sort of proliferation of some people sharing them as sort of dark imagery, but others then trying to reassert her life with sort of pictures of flowers and hearts and her alive. So there's almost a sort of contested space even within social media. And I suppose those sorts of dark episodes are not those that come to the fore straight away with social media, but there's definitely a dark side to some social media as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and you make a good point about it being personal space, and what are we putting out there that is personal as well. So if we're putting something personal into a public forum, is it personal anymore?
No, it isn't.
And that, I suppose that's where then we come into the crime element of if it's personal in a public space, and then we're saying, well, people are following that information, they're even stalking us to a degree, then but we've provided them with that information. So it's such a fine line, and with the case that you just stated, unfortunately, people are at risk of being abused, whether they're alive or dead, unfortunately. And
and it's a very sort of dark. It's the dark element that's quite interesting, because I think in some ways all these social media sites are quite often, even if you protect them, there's still an element of them that is, as you say, is open public knowledge. But people, because they associate with them with their very person don't necessarily share in a way that they would in everyday interaction. And one of the ones I found quite interesting straight away, and it's a longer backstory, but involved knowing burglars using Facebook. So when Facebook sort of started to launch the Facebook check-in thing, if people were posting up pictures of their home and their address and then going off to check into a holiday resort in the Mediterranean for a week, it's a sort of invitation to, if you haven't got the full levels of protection on your side, to say my home is empty. And certainly I know that there were cases and instances where offenders were using that sort of information to target people. But similarly with those sorts of check-ins, they can be your photographs. Instagram posts photographs up of where you are, for example. So if you're sort of posting up pictures of I am here at the moment, it makes you quite locatable, for example.
Well, that's it, yeah. I think people don't even realise if they're checking in at the gym that's saying I'm not at home, or that's saying I'm at the gym, this is where I am if you want to come and find me. And I was actually discussing this with my family last night, and we were saying about, especially around photographs of children, if you're taking a photograph of your child and posting it on Facebook on their first day of school, you're making it very clear what school that child goes to. They're in the uniform. And then if you're, posting their group photo on school sports day or something.
There's another sort of dimension there when you think about consent, because at the end of the day, it's if I as a child, can you actually consent to have your image put on the internet? Yet from this day and age, even before birth, your scan picture is put online. The day you're born is put online. These people, their entire life now, there's a generation that's only ever known life online. Yeah. And it's almost like you've got two sort of, you got your digital self and then your real self. And, so like I said, I can choose whether I want to be put on a picture. Whereas somebody else, who's
an unborn child
can't. You can't.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting as well, because then there's the blurred lines between sort of the personal consent of young people. So one I think about is when you gave the example of the school sports day, and I don't think people would necessarily think of that, but you can take a picture of your own child in the school sports day. But you don't know that the child running behind your own child isn't on the child protection register and isn't necessarily, and that photo goes viral and gets seen by someone who has been removed from that child's life, and you've just identified where they are again. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can come straight at the dark side, but there's almost a sort of banal element at times that we don't think about. You can deal with it through the sort of personal, what about my life and what about me giving away my location? But there's so much more to it with the sort of spread of sort of the digital world in a way.
And taking it one step further as well, even things that don't appear so public, if you're sharing an image, that social media app or whatever it might be owns that image. So if it's WhatsApp, that WhatsApp owns your images if you're sharing them. So in the same way that you might share family photographs on WhatsApp, that's still going into some public domain to some degree. The same way like with Google location on your phone, all it takes is somebody to hack your Google location and see exactly where you've been.
And particularly when it moves to the dark side, because we said we're going to talk about coercive control, and this is a concept that sort of emerged relatively recently in criminology, although we've been concerned about domestic violence for quite some time. Coercive control is something that's slightly different, and it's a broader acknowledgement in some ways that the kind of behaviour that occurs in family and intimate relationships is sometimes not premised on overt physical violence, but more controlling behaviour generally. Now, with the length of the podcast, we won't give all the details of necessarily what coercive control is. It kind of came in with the Serious Crime Act in 2015, which is a bit of a catch-all piece of legislation that in some ways was quite interesting, because it plugged, I was talking about it the other day, it plugged several gaps sometimes where people would expect there to be law. So it was never illegal, for example, to possess a knife in prison, and the Serious Serious Crime Act made it illegal to possess knives in prison. It was very much a sort of act in some ways that covered other elements. But there'd been a long campaign before that recognised that it's not just necessarily partners being violent, but it was quite often in domestic situations that they were more broadly manipulative, that they'd control finances, that they'd control people's access to other people, that they'd monitor movements, for example. And particularly with things like monitoring movements, that's where social media comes in some ways, isn't it? Yeah. That we see... that essentially you see, particularly with things like the rise of stalking behaviour, that's quite tied to social media.
Yeah, 100%. And I suppose, have you seen the show You on Netflix? So basically that is about that. So the author of it was originally a book and then it became the Netflix documentary, Netflix show. It was about like us being so open about everything that we were doing online, and then people taking advantage of that and following your every movement.
Taking advantage. I think it's because you're putting everything out there. People think that they know you.
And they can use
and
that
they're already having a relationship with you because they see your pictures, they see what you're doing, what you're having for tea. Yeah. They think they intimately know you already. Yeah. I mean, I have certain people. I think to myself on Facebook, it's like, I don't even know who the you are, but like they like my pictures and looking as lovely as ever. I'm like, who are you?
Well, this is interesting because when we think of stalking as well, and particularly words like stalking, which is a way perhaps that coercive control has become sort of slightly blended in the public mind with stalking, although they are different because the legislation around coercive control, it requires that existing relationship between people, whereas stalking there may not necessarily be an association. But particularly when you think about stalking, you quite often think about the celebrity cases. We think about the obsessive fan in a way, and that's been a sort of popular idea in so much traditional media representation and drama and so on, because the celebrity figure has a sort of public profile and lots is known about them. There's lots of shots of them. Their favourite food is talked about in magazines. So the stalker kind of forms an attraction. Yeah. But one of the things with social media in some ways and our managed online lives is people perhaps are knowing far more about other people than ever they were traditionally.
Yeah, it's having access to all those micro moments in people's lives, isn't it? Those tiny little things, like you say, like what you've had for your tea. But it's also that people are using that information to learn so much more about you that maybe you don't actually want them to. Even though we're putting that information out there, do we actually want anybody in the world?
Don't you think that we live in a celebrity culture where it's forced upon, especially the young people? It's like my daughter likes Love Island, and it's just
we were
everybody
bound to end up talking about Love Island at some point. Everyone's talking about Love Island.
Yeah, well, to be fair, it's like we're bombarded with this imagery. It's like fake it until you make it sort of culture. So people are going on Instagram, I want to be an influencer, and they're putting themselves out there, especially like young people, to become this next celebrity. I mean, you've got like the successes of people that started off on social media that now have got successful careers, and they just want to tap into that. So they are making themselves vulnerable.
Yeah, it's the science behind it as well, though. Like when we're putting things out there onto social media and they're being engaged with and they're being liked, that makes us want that more. It's like
that validation,
a virtual hug, basically. Yeah. So especially if you're being exposed to that from such a young age when your brain's still developing, and that's what you accept as being validation, like you say, that's making people really, really vulnerable to that, and then they will share more because they want more acknowledgement, and then that's when they say,
"Got so many likes."
Yeah, I want to be an influencer. Because I want even more likes, and then it's like a vicious circle.
And of course, those things can also be monetised as well. So these
everything's monetised.
Well, Kyla was going to say,
everything.
But I think it is important that there's a sort of recognition that people can then. So young people are seeing people trade successfully off their influencer status. They then do get sent free things. People will endorse them. They'll pay to have products endorsed. Well, we're hoping. Well, one of the purposes of this show now, Kyla, is to make your dog
even more famous
than.
No, to be fair, it's like I don't think I would have as many people liking my Instagram if it was just me. But my dog, the whole world loves my dog. And then I get messages saying, if we send you our product, would you get Ziggy to wear it? So I'll put a name out there now. My dog's going to be stalked. And take a picture. And I'm just like, this is weird.
If
do you do it?
To send me
No, I haven't done it. I haven't done it. But my husband's like, do it, get free stuff. I want free stuff. I was like, no.
It's creating a strange world of sort of associations with people that we know and we don't know. But then the other side with crime, and particularly thinking about crime, is some social media platforms are actually extending the people's ability to actually interact with one another, because part of it is communication. So although we say, you don't know these people, the direct messaging services that are part of things like
to get
Facebook
this out there. We have to talk about dick pics. I'm not being funny, but years ago, you would be walking through the park and some fella would like whop it out. Now it's just like, whoa, do you know what I mean? It's like, I didn't want that this first thing this morning. It's like, we're digitalising sort of like, the whole flashing situation. So
yeah, and then I suppose that's the sexual harassment element of it as well.
Apparently that's the standard norm, sending each other parts and stuff.
Well, I don't think there's any standard norm in sending your parts digitally.
Apparently it's a thing.
That
but,
comes into revenge porn as well, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and okay, so if we're sending that when we're in a relationship or whatever we're doing, then
the next minute,
then we're not anymore. That can be anywhere.
Absolutely,
girls have killed themselves after.
Exactly. Yeah,
and an awful
really
lot,
risky.
and an awful lot of legislation. Then it tries to play catch up, which is very, very difficult. And when we were talking about even who exists, for example, there are all sorts of things now about thinking about how legislation in the future can deal with the fact that you can be superimposed, your image can be faked. What might appear to be you might not be you, and it's interesting with things like, in particular with things like romance scams. One of the things that quite often is used is people will search the internet for particular sort of strong male-looking types in military uniform, which will then be cropped. So you find that the soldiers that have served in Afghanistan end up being used in a romance scam without their knowledge about it at all, because of the picture that they put on Facebook, or the gym-going sports people, or fit and physically attractive young women become essentially have a profile that they know nothing about, and it's only when Google Images are searched. And it's funny how things that can be sort of very fake become associated with you. I've said on this a few times, I happen to share my name with a cricketer and also the author of fantasy books.
That's what makes me laugh.
And it gets me completely mixed up. So I get a couple of emails a year where people go, your Advent trilogy, which I didn't write, it's nothing to do with me. It's fantastic, James. What a brilliant piece of fiction. And you go, no, he came from the Oxford and he's not me. But you get that sort of blurring, and it can even become difficult to tell what's real and what's fake as well.
Yeah.
So there are interesting things in all sorts of ways, but with that sort of fake interaction, there is still real interaction, and one of the ways that we've seen that come to the fore, particularly in crime-related matters, is with things like dating sites. So we get I've never been on one, but Tinder, for example, swipe left and swipe right.
Up or down?
Up or down, or super like. I have no idea. But things like Tinder are now featuring in how people form relationships. Tell us a bit about Tinder.
Yeah, well, so basically it is, how there's things like Plenty of Fish and the online dating sites we traditionally think you go on, you set up a profile on the PC and that kind of thing. So it's taking that and putting it on a mobile device. And so from my understanding, you can put in your radius of where you'd like to scan for humans and whichever you would like to, and you set like the age range or that kind of thing, and then you will get a portfolio of people to either swipe left or right on. If you're swiping right, I'm assuming you're accepting some sort of communication in the future from them. If you swipe left, then that's no no, not for me. If you super liking, then you're sort of sending them a notification to say, I really like you, will you get in touch?
Okay, so you can get likes, super likes, and these dating apps can tend to feature, for example, both in the foregrounding of crimes, but also then in the background as well, because there are all sorts of cases, for example, where jealousy is born out of the fact that dating apps are found on people's phones. Increasingly, it challenges sort of relationships that people have. And again, when we were talking about elements of coercive control, that managing access to people traditionally that came in sort of quite controlling and coercive relationships could be, for example, you're not allowed to see your family, I don't get on with them, I don't like them.
Or now it's like, that lad you went to school with, just like 2 of your pictures, what the hell's going on?
Yeah,
what's
absolutely.
been happening?
And we find it becoming part of that sort of background of control. But also it's in the foreground. Very much, these apps can be very much in the foreground of some cases, and one of them is the case of Stephen Port, isn't it? Who was known as the Grindr killer. Before we get into that one, can you tell us a little bit about Grindr and?
Yeah, so Grindr is basically the gay social media network, similar to Tinder but a gay dating site. And in the case of Stephen Port, he lured his victims using it. So he lured them on Grindr and then met up with them and then murdered them.
Yeah, the Port case, for those that don't know, I mean, Stephen Port is a serial killer. He's now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He came back into the media, although his case wasn't perhaps given as much attention as some other serial killers. He came back into the media recently because he himself had also been the victim of a crime, and someone else convicted of using Grindr and dealing in a drug, GHB, had previously drugged and robbed Port. But essentially, chemsex and the chemsex scene and the sort of gay chemsex scene around Grindr very much explained Port. He ultimately ended up drugging and killing 4 young males, and Port was quite fixated on quite small males, young small males. And what he would do essentially is use the drug GHB to basically overdose them, make them go unconscious. He was then committing sexual offences against them, and ultimately bodies of 4 young men were found. It was only subsequently, and with quite a lot of pressure actually, that there was an investigation where ultimately what he'd done came to light. So he was sort of still at large and at liberty. And in the first instances, there were sort of several failures to really properly investigate what had been murders. They were made to look like suicides in one case where he even sort of forged the letter, the suicide letter of a victim. But also there were tones of sort of drug-related overdose to it as well. So the Port case is quite an interesting one, although less known one. But this sort of foregrounding of meeting on Grindr, going out to talk, using it as a means to sort of lure in victims certainly became something that the press picked up on. And that is something that we see, I think, increasingly perhaps with social media, that there is now a sort of emerging narrative in the press about bad people using social media in a way and playing on that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that the bad people are still out there, whether they're using social media or not. They're using it just in a different means, and if they're the same way that we're using social media now to communicate and to have conversations and that kind of thing, they are using it as a forum to be able to popularize what they do. I think it's really just how they are moving to that digital platform to be able to share what they do in a more public forum, in the same way that Stephen was using it as the way to lure his victims in. He's just developing that form that he might have done maybe if you met him in a pub or something beforehand.
Well, one of the things I find quite interesting about that case, and I think it goes back to something that we were talking about earlier on, is when you read about when you read a bit of the background of Port, he's described as quite a sort of lonely and isolated individual in some ways. He works as a chef, but he sort of lives in a flat on his own, a little bit like Dennis Nielsen, who was similarly a gay male serial killer who died fairly recently. He seemed to struggle in some ways to sort of form relationships with people a little bit, and that's one of the
kind
things
of
that comes up.
happens if you kill off. Same time
true.
Next week, darling.
But it's interesting in a way what social media does, because it can, particularly things like Grindr and Tinder, can mean that first stage of having to go out and connect with people is taken care of for you in a way that previously, and it interestingly in Port's background, and I'm not suggesting these things are indicative of someone who's going to go on to become a serial killer, or that you can ever tell it, but there are some interesting parts that are written about, for example, him being a bit of a sort of oddball, eccentric, not necessarily being able to connect with other people, playing with toys, and until he was, sort of far later in life, showing sort of measures of some immaturity and inability. But of course, the thing that's quite interesting about social media is some of these dating sites are only really quite superficial. They're appearance-based, so if you look okay, people in the first instance aren't making judgments on you on anything other than
your looks, what you look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bit of information. So it sort of removes that first step of having to go out perhaps to the bar to pick someone up or talk to people, and makes that connection for you.
Yeah, so I guess for people that are more reserved and socially awkward, maybe it helps them to make that first step.
And that can be a brilliant thing as well.
But also it puts the risk there, doesn't it, that we're removing that natural element of people meeting each other face to face and making those human connections that are so important for any relationship. So is it actually feeding these unhealthy relationships that we're using social media apps and removing that natural?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because you see it play out around you, don't you? I mean, we all go out for sort of meals and so on, and you only have to have a little bit of awareness of what's going on in the world around you to see some of that happening. So I'm in a restaurant with my wife, and you can quite quickly sometimes tell that,
like the ones I got stuck with the other day. Yes.
People aren't necessarily perhaps meeting up for a first date with little in common, and they may end up. Kyla sort of says, like the one she got stuck with the other day. You've seen it play out.
I have, and they just have nothing in common, and they're just kind of talking at each other, and it's sort of very sort of strained, and I do think as well. I mean, if you are doing that, you go to a restaurant with somebody you've never met before, you need to be careful, don't you? You don't know who you're meeting. You need to you need to make sure you're going somewhere public, and it's that whole sort of, do you leave with them? It's a minefield.
And I think because especially on social media, like apps like Tinder and Grindr, you're only communicating usually with that person via message. You're not actually speaking to that person. So it's making sure that before you meet anybody, that you're having a phone call with them, that you are meeting them in a public place, that you've actually started following them on other social media platforms, so you're more aware of who they are.
Stalking them on other social media platforms.
But then that, even in that joke, Carla, there is something there, isn't there? Because in some ways, how we engage and follow people now, which could look which could look almost sort of stalkerish or controlling.
It's a norm, isn't it? It's how
it
you
can
get
also
to know
become
somebody.
a norm. So it does make it, and that I think in some ways is where perhaps some of the difficulties lie. I mean, similarly, and it's a slightly different case, so I won't talk too much of it. But the big case to sort of break the story of coercive control in relationships in some ways was the murder of the conviction for murder of Sally Challoner, and she'd been in an abusive relationship, ultimately had killed her partner, striking him sort of 20 times on the head with a hammer. She appealed, and part of that appeal was to do with the controlling and violent relationship that she'd been in with him. But what I found quite interesting when you actually read through the judgment is that there's almost a sort of controlling behaviour then on both parts, where they're both watching what each other are doing on social media, where they're both tracking one another's movements. And it's almost as if the sort of social media world can sort of push that upon people as an expectation.
Funny
you
have
to follow your partner. Why haven't you liked my Facebook post?
It goes further than that. It's like when you're on Facebook and say, for example, you get a friend request from somebody, say, for example, Kyla and Rich Lawton. You're like, which one of you cheated? You know what I mean? You're not allowed your own social media.
It's also if you're tempted at any point to look at your partner's Facebook or his Facebook
they leave
messages
the phone
or whatever,
there, you're like,
messages are there,
I've
or if a
not
message
done
even
that.
pops up and you're reading it, is that being like...
Where's the privacy?
Absolutely, and of course, if that message you were to read then arouses suspicion, to what extent does that pull you in? Because the other thing is the platforms are very much designed with individual psychology in mind to engage them and pull them in and make them look deeper. So to what extent do you hold the individual accountable? But there is then also something interesting in that debate around social media, because in sort of badging, when we were talking about the case of Port, there's that sort of badging of him as the grinder killer, and it has a certain sort of ring to it, doesn't it?
Well, to be fair, at the end of the day, this is always media. You've got your media-led thing. If you just say the guy that killed somebody, you need to give them a bit of a flashy title, don't you?
Yeah.
And also, it deflects from all the other failings in the case, because let's face it, there was a lot of failings in the case, because as per usual, any sort of violence toward the LGBTQ plus community tends to get brushed under the carpet, not investigated properly. So
I think that's a really, really interesting point, because in some ways, the way that Port is remembered already is as the fact we're using the term, the grinder killer. It's not remembered as a sort of failing by the Metropolitan Police, the next in a long and ongoing series, I'd hasten to add, to properly investigate the deaths of gay men at the hands of other gay men. And there's a very sort of, for me, there's a very overt sort of tone of homophobia to those failed investigations. I mean, if we go back to the case of Nielsen that I was talking about previously, in his case, going right the way back, the same police force, the Metropolitan Police, had been called to domestic disturbances. They weren't domestic disturbances at all. They were in effect Dennis Nielsen attempting to strangle a victim to death, and sort of dismissed it as a gay domestic tiff, and there have been serial failures, particularly at and around cases where males have been the victims of other males, to investigate those properly. And it's interesting in the case of Port, because what you have with the grinder killer is that other side, that investigatory failure, which was multifaceted. I mean, if you look at it, there's for example, one of the victims, Port had forged a suicide note for him. The police failed to show the suicide note to the family, who would have been able to say, that's not our son's writing. That would have raised alarm bells earlier. They failed to have forensic tests done.
Don't you think there's also kind of an element of victim blaming going on as well? The grinder killer, you were using Grindr.
Well, I think, because Grindr's got quite a negative reputation anyway, for what it's used for. And I think if you're, like you say, if you're using it, then are you almost putting yourself in that situation where this thing could or should happen to you?
Yeah.
And
quite different, for example, to Tinder, because it's the sort of unacceptability of, because Grindr, there's an association with it being used as sort of gay male hookup and move on, used for sex in effect, which again sort of encompasses lots of sort of stereotypical attitudes towards the gay community.
It is. It's stereotypical, because heterosexual people just hook up for sex as well.
Well, quite often on Tinder. So there's a sort of double standard at play there, which I think is quite interesting. And but it is interesting that we haven't as yet had sort of the same labels applied to Tinder. Yeah. But I think simmering away in the background, there will be all sorts of sort of tensions and lower level harms and damages. Alongside, I would also say, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who've met and formed very happy relationships on Tinder. Maybe, I don't know.
I have friends that have met on dating sites and are very happily married, and so these things do happen.
I'd be terrified of even using one. I wouldn't. I wouldn't know where to start. They didn't exist when you know. And
you used to have the personal ads in the paper, didn't you?
Yeah, and I always used to wonder: did anyone ever really put those in? There's always a sort of fakeness to.
It's just changed what we expect in society so much, hasn't it?
Feeds into insecurity, I think. Definitely feeds into insecurity.
Like if you're single, you're assumed to be on Tinder or on Grindr. Like you're just assumed to do that. Whereas you're not assumed to go to a social occasion and meet somebody in a normal setting. Like that's not what you do anymore. And it's so
quite
strange.
It's quite interesting the way that's that it is almost sort of changing the social world and social life in many ways. It's in a way that perhaps some people are finding it even harder. So I started off by talking about those sort of assumptions as well about how these are used particularly by younger people, but I'm sure it's also the case that there are probably all sorts of sites being developed and targeted at an older community.
To be fair, you'll find that a lot of people who are getting older now are divorcing and using these apps as well. Yeah. I mean, there was a bit of a sort of thing a while ago saying that there was sexually transmitted diseases were going up in the over 50s bracket because they were all sort of coming out of relationships now, because it's not like it was where you just stayed the long haul. It's like, no, kids have gone, you do my head in, we're off, we're splitting up. And then they're sort of like going out and hooking up and stuff, and they're not sort of like aware of the younger generation of the pitfalls of.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about social media more generally, but to talk specifically about some crimes, one of the ways that social media is used, as we've noted, is stalking or sort of cyber stalking or controlling former partners or indeed just sort of using social media platforms to target former partners. And there's there are sort of several interesting cases that we could look at with this. Now, the thing is, most of the time we tend to think of the sort of obsessive and controlling partner or the stalker as being male, but that's not always the case, is it? Because particularly there's an interesting case that comes from this year, February this year in 2019, involving a chap called Mark Weeks and his partner Jessica Norquist, and that sort of perhaps transforms a little bit how we might think about stalking. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Yeah, so basically Mark met Jessica when they worked together in, I think, a London agency, and I think they were together for maybe 3 months, not very long at all. But from what we've read about it seems that Nordquist got very obsessed with Mark, and then started doing quite odd things, like pretending that she was pregnant, like wearing a fake pregnancy bump, and then she faked her own kidnap to try and get his attention. But a lot of that was communicated through fake social media accounts that she'd set up.
And there were loads of these fake media accounts as well, weren't there? So she really, there are about 40 different social media profiles that were set up, all sort of related to these elaborate stories, some of them just simply being used to threaten, some of them... but there's something interesting in that access to how easy it is to set up a social media account, in that it's very, very democratic in a way.
Weeks was actually trying to change the laws of social media and the rules of being able to set up social media accounts without having any sort of verification of who you are. And some of them you do have to either like send a passport photo or that kind of thing to verify the account. But the main ones, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you don't have to do any of that sort of verification, and those are probably the ones that people use the most.
Yeah, absolutely.
To access that information.
You do actually, from somebody that has not... You know why? You do. I had to send a picture of myself.
Oh,
now,
did you?
yeah. Thing is, though, because I had already got an account. Thing is, though, we're just looking at the nefarious sort of setting up an account here in a different name or whatever. But I have friends that have set up social media accounts in different names because of abusive ex-partners, and you've got to, the whole you have to use your real name thing. I think that can be a very sort of state-controlled element as well. Why should people have to use their real name?
Yeah,
I think we could use these cases for the state to implement this sort of controlling behaviour.
But that's what puts people at risk, that they are having to use their real name because they are so easily searchable. And that's how Nordquist obviously started following him on so many different accounts that she could just search for him easily.
But it's an interesting thing, isn't it, in some ways, because the very nature of social media in some ways sort of almost compels us to be pulled in and engaged. And then, for some people, when they're very pulled in and engaged, and I'm in no way sort of defending what Nordquist did, but when she almost sort of became obsessive, it's almost like that's exceptional. But at the same time, the sites are sort of trying to engender that continuing, ever-checking engagement, that sort of deeper immersion into them.
Yeah, I think there's also the responsibility of how we are setting up those accounts as well, because you can make your account really private. I don't have Facebook anymore. I deleted my account, but in like the latter time that I had it, I made sure that it was all shut down, that people couldn't just search for me and find me and that kind of thing. And those are just in your privacy settings, and you can go in and do that. But perhaps those social media accounts need to make you aware of how to do those things more clearly, because they are so hard to access and find if you don't already know what to do. And we were talking earlier about the older generation that maybe isn't as savvy with social media. Do they know how to do it, and would they naturally be more aware of what is out there and available to be accessed? So
and I think that is an interesting point. Because it's about where does the sort of responsibility lie? And I'm not in no way, shape, or form. I mean, ultimately, Nordquist ended up jailed for her behaviour. Which was clearly sort of very obsessive and had an impact. And we've seen several sort of cases of men jailed for coercive control now. And only some of that necessarily plays out on social media, because there is also that other side of actually sort of restricting people's access to finances and so on. It's not all social media. There is still an element that's about, and similarly, turning up in people's workplaces and so on. It blurs the lines between sort of media.
To frame it around social media is a way to, if we look at social media as a big bad, then it's easy to sort of call for regulations. So obviously that's then us being monitored all the time. Well, we are anyway, but being monitored all the time about what we say, what we put, and then are we heading towards a more sort of like restrictive sort of like Chinese type system? Because we use the bad cases to say, well, these 5 things happened which is terrible, let's now legislate against it. And we'll go, yes, please legislate because these 5 things happened, not the millions of interactions every single day that people have that are fine.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because particularly when you think, for example, about the response in the Nordquist case, which is to try and shut down people's use of being anonymous. Now, I can certainly understand that there are some platforms where you would not necessarily want people to be anonymous, and you want people to be open. And again, if you're going to troll people on social media, anonymity is a part of it. But there's another side as well, which the counterpoint always is, how can that anonymity, for example, be useful for some people? So, for example, particularly if you're moving away from a coercive or controlling relationship by changing to perhaps a name that wouldn't be recognised by your former partner, could as you say, can be really empowering.
It's even in some cases where, if you're in a job that puts you in an awkward position. If you're a social worker or a teacher and that kind of thing, and you maybe don't want to include your full name because you don't want to be so exposed.
Yeah, and I mean, similarly...
and also some activists as well, because at the end of the day, if you are on a platform where you are trying to provide a different narrative, there are people out there that would be quite upset with this. And there has been cases where people who are align themselves very far left or on the left have been found by people on the right, extreme right cases, have used social media to find where these people live and say, we know where you live, we're going to come around and kick your face in, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. So there's another layer of why somebody might want to keep a bit of anonymity on social networks.
Yeah,
it's for safety reasons, massive safety reasons.
Absolutely. So to sort of react to the worst case examples may as well be sort of equally problematic. To set that as the precedent, and that everybody else must always provide full name, verified email address, credit card details.
Like I said about Port, if those negative people that are doing these bad things are out there, they're going to take advantage of whatever platform they want to. It doesn't mean that everybody on that platform is doing that thing. And social media is such a useful tool for so many people and communicating, and it's broadened so many things and raised so much awareness about stuff. Like if we think about Black Lives Matter and all that kind of thing, these are things that are happening around the world that we just wouldn't have been exposed to before.
So in some ways, the sort of takeaway message about social media is use carefully and responsibly, but some people won't, and simply be aware of the fact that some people may not. Laura, that is absolutely fascinating, and so thank you ever so much. So all it remains for me to do now is to thank you for listening to Crime Tapes. If you've been interested in the topics that we've been talking about today, do check out the courses that we offer at Staffordshire University. Discussion of social media forms part of a huge range of the degree options that we have, whether it be in the School of Law, Policing and Forensics or elsewhere. So thank you once again, Laura, for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
And thank you to my regular co-presenter, Kyla.
Sorry, I'm just updating my social media.
And all it remains for me to do is to thank Adam Buckridge for making the music for the podcast. He's a student here at Staffordshire University. We do music courses too. And I'll see you next time on Crime Tapes.
Crime Tapes couldn't happen without the remarkable students and staff in the Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Do you see yourself as a crime investigator, researcher, or even preventing crime and protecting the community on the front line in the police force? Whatever your future holds, a great education is the first step into making it a reality. Browse our courses at staffs.ac.uk and discover your potential.